So we are already live. Come closer to me.
Okay.
And we're having, because this is a new phone, we're having a little bit of technical issues, but we are right here and 3 people have joined us. And so people are going to be joining from all over the world. Hi, Joe. Meet Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who happens to be visiting from England, and he's right now at my apartment. And I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to him about his new book, which has been out in England for a while, but it is now coming out in America as well. I'm just giving people a little time to join us, so you can see there are 147 people already, and they're from all over the world. And because I have a new phone, it keeps reminding me to do some other settings. But we're ready to go. We have 200 people, and then more will join us, and we can start. So first of all, thank you for joining me, Rupert.
It's very good to see you, Deepak.
Yeah, and how are things with you and your family?
Very, very well.
Jill is in England at the moment, I presume?
Yes.
And your sons are also in England?
Actually not. My son Merlin is in Canada, and my son Cosmo is in Germany. He's doing a music tour with his new album.
Yeah. And they're following in your footsteps in a way, but through their own channels,
In
right?
their own way,
In
yes.
their own way. So Rupert, let's talk about your book and how did you come to write it and what can people get from it. Once again, the book is called Science and Spiritual Practices. Tell us about it.
Well, I came to write it because, on the one hand, as you know, I'm a scientist. On the other hand, I've been taking part in a whole range of spiritual practices for years. And so it combines 2 sides of my own life. But also there's now a lot of scientific studies of spiritual practices that show on the whole what the effects they have, measurable effects, and how good they are for you. I mean, this is very much one of your own themes. And the 7 I discuss in the book are meditation, gratitude, connecting with nature, relating to plants, singing and chanting, rituals, and pilgrimage. And these are all things that anyone can do, whether they do it within a religious context or not.
So these practices have been around for many years, thousands of years,
Yes.
in many spiritual traditions from all over the world. See, now you have people from Norway and Louisiana and all over the world
This
joining
is amazing.
us.
I've never done this before.
Yeah, well, you're connecting with people globally on spiritual practices and science. So let's go over them again. You said
Well, first
meditation,
secondly gratitude, thirdly relating to the more than human world or connecting with nature, plants, especially trees and flowers, then singing and chanting, and then rituals,
right? So
and finally pilgrimage.
So what's the science? What does the science say if we practice these rituals or these processes? It connects us to a deeper domain of our...
Well, the science doesn't necessarily show that they connect us to a deeper domain, but they show that they have beneficial effects on people's psychological and spiritual health. And in some cases, like pilgrimage, it's about walking on pilgrimage to physical health as well, of course, through walking.
So you've, of course, Rupert, been doing this for now decades, these practices. And I have a background in what we call mind-body medicine. And recently actually we finished a study along with Harvard Medical School. And actually one of the participants in the study was a Nobel laureate, Elizabeth Blackburn. And we had colleagues from everywhere else, from UCSD and from UC San Diego, UC California, in San Francisco, Scripps. And we had a 1-week retreat where people practiced both mantra meditation, breath awareness, and a little bit of reflective self-inquiry. So before meditation, they close their eyes, put their attention in their heart, and then they basically ask simple questions like, who am I? What do I want? Do I have a purpose in my life? What am I grateful for? Not necessarily focusing on any answers, but just waiting for any response to come that comes in the form of a sensation or an image or a feeling or a thought. And in 1 week, we saw that all the genes that actually cause self-regulation or homeostasis, they went up. Some went up in their activity 17-fold. And the other genes that cause inappropriate inflammation went down significantly. The enzyme telomerase, which is what Elizabeth Blackburn got the Nobel Prize for, went up by 40% in 1 week. Now, to my knowledge, this had never been shown before. We got the paper published in one of Nature's publications, Translational Psychology, Nature, the British journal. And this led to a spate of other people replicating the research with everything from mindfulness to just body awareness to reflective self-inquiry to mantra meditation. And universally now the results are being replicated, not exact same findings because the practices are different, but in almost every case there's genetic activity in the direction of self-regulation or healing or homeostasis and away from inflammation. This is monumental in its implications.
It's incredible, yes.
Because we used to think, once you know the genome, you know everything, but it's not at all that way. It seems gene activity is more important, right?
Indeed, and some of it's heritable epigenetically. So,
correct.
What I find most interesting about modern meditation situation is that there's all these studies showing the effects like yours on gene activity. There's lots of older studies showing the effect on reducing stress, lowering blood pressure, counteracting depression, and so on. But this has now become the frontier of the debate with the atheists, because some of the leading atheists like Sam Harris, he's now giving online meditation courses.
Yes.
And and Susan Blackmore, who's one of our leading public atheists in Britain.
She attacked me very viciously many years ago.
Well, you see, she's a confirmed Zen meditator.
Yes.
And so what's interesting is that there are now a lot of people who are atheists and materialists who meditate, and they think it's all just in the brain or all just in the body. And this is, in a sense, the new frontier of the debate about the existence of God. Old-style atheists just rejected all spiritual practices as pointless mumbo-jumbo. New-style atheists are taking up spiritual practices and are saying, Sam Harris, what he says is we must pluck the diamond of spiritual practice from the dung heap of religion. So, although he was initiated into the Dzogchen tradition by a leading Lama, he treats with contempt the entire tradition from which he's learned and uses all this derogatory language. And what they're seeking to provide is a kind of spiritually based atheism. Now that seems to me a really interesting development and not something that's happened very much before.
I debated Sam Harris many years ago, and he was very contentious, but also very dogmatic and also in a way condescending, because, as you say, he treats any religious idea with contempt. And he does believe that consciousness is a product of the brain. But we know there's a brain because we are conscious, right? Even the brain is an experiencing consciousness.
Of course.
So, I mean, anything that we know of, we have to be first aware of it.
Yes.
And then there are other people, particularly, there's a neuroscientist in England, Anil Seth. I don't know if you've
I haven't
met
come across
her.
him.
So he's in England, and he's Indian background, but he's British for all practical purposes. And he gave a very interesting talk recently that what we call everyday reality is a controlled hallucination produced by the human brain. So of course I asked him if the everyday reality is a controlled hallucination produced by the brain, is the brain a controlled hallucination produced by other brains? So, they kind of go round and round in circles trying to explain what I would call a superstition, and that's the superstition of matter. Because, matter is a human construct for an experience, isn't it? I mean, this table right now, this body, this thing, before you can call it a magazine or whatever, it's an experience of color, shape, form, sensation. And then human beings come along and they give constructs to these experiences, calling this a book, or calling this a body, or calling this table physical matter. But what we call physical matter, I think, is just a mental interpretation of a perceptual activity in consciousness. After all, perception, you can't have perception without consciousness.
No.
And any sensation we have is a modified form of consciousness, including the sensation of the object we call the brain.
Absolutely. I mean, what it seems to me, you see, is that the reason in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I focus on practices, which is, I know, very much your own approach as well.
Yes.
Is that practices lead to experiences, and I think that what you're saying, what I'm also saying, is experience comes first. And the attempt to explain the experience of meditation or any other experience in terms of matter in the brain is saying the theory comes first. That we'd rather interpret our own direct experience in terms of a theory, which is basically a belief system. So basically it's saying that I put more trust in a materialist belief system that says matter is the primary reality, consciousness is derived from
And
matter.
even scientifically, matter turns out to be non-material as we go deeper into the nature. I asked Frank Wilczek, he's a Nobel laureate, he won the...
Yeah, I read his book, the one on beauty.
Yeah, which is very beautifully written. But I asked him, is matter material? And he paused and he said, we're still trying to figure out the dynamic nature of matter. But he didn't answer my question.
No.
Is matter material? Because the other thing that I think about a lot of times is that our human experience, and you are a biologist, so you should be able to actually tell me much more about this, but our experience of what we call everyday reality, the human experience, is a narrow bandwidth of the totality of experience. A dolphin doesn't have the same experience as a human or a bat or a snake. Or I was reading the other day about this very interesting butterfly called the painted lady, and it seems this butterfly smells through her antenna, tastes food through her feet, hears through the wings, and has 30,000 lenses to the eyes. So what is that butterfly experiencing? It must be experiencing something totally alien to me, right?
Yes.
So is this now what we're experiencing, just a very narrow band of the infinite consciousness that is modulating itself as all these species of consciousness having their own infinite worlds, bands of
It seems to
infinite.
me obvious that must be the case. But what puzzles me over and over again is why materialists are such true believers. I mean, this is an incredibly powerful faith system. They take on faith, a belief in the nature of matter, which by their own confession is least good at explaining consciousness. In fact, it has no explanation of consciousness. And so what's, to me, the puzzle is how have so many people been hypnotized by this belief system to the degree that they think that it's
For now,
unquestionably
almost
true.
300 years.
Yes.
And going on, even though the Newtonian model kind of fell apart after Einstein and then all the quantum revolution, it fell apart, but the belief in matter is still very strong.
Incredibly strong.
So this is where I think your book comes in. As a scientist, you can see that what we call everyday experience is species specific. It's also culture specific. And it's also, in a sense, belief specific, because even our construct of what we think the world is or who we think we are is filtered through these constructs, through these human constructs,
Absolutely.
which are based on a very limited band of the range of experience in nature.
Absolutely.
So tell me then, why is being in touch with nature a spiritual practice?
Well, I think that being in touch with nature is, first of all, many people have mystical experiences in connection with nature. So even without doing any practice at all, many people in childhood and in later life, when they're in forests, on mountain tops, on the beach, relating to the stars, feel a sense of connection with something greater than themselves. And I think that this is a spontaneous kind of mystical experience that's been common all through history and all through human history. And studies in England by the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Unit have shown that these kinds of spontaneous mystical experiences are extremely common in children as well. So I think probably one of our most primal ways of experiencing a sense of connection with something greater than ourselves, which is what I think a spiritual experience is, comes about through nature. And
because we are expressions of nature, right?
because we're expressions of nature, and of course we are connected with nature. Without the entire universe and evolutionary process, we wouldn't be here. And we're totally interconnected with everything on this planet, and this planet's couldn't exist without the sun and the solar system, and that couldn't exist without the galaxy. So it's simply a literal scientific fact that we're connected, and normally we think of it in terms of diagrams, formulae, diagrams in books of the solar system, equations about gravity, but those are all theoretical constructs. The direct experience is one that we can also have and is much more powerful, that we are connected. And we can actually cultivate this connection. Some people do it through spending time in forests, and this Japanese research on forest bathing has shown that people who spend time in the greenery of forests have lower stress levels, reduced blood pressure and so on, compared with people who go for a walk of equal length in urban settings. I mean, in a way, this is all obvious. But I think that the practice of connecting with nature is actually, for many people, one of their primary spiritual practices. And even some of the most militant atheists are open to this one. I think what's important is that even for those who've rejected God and who think spirituality is a waste of time, if not a superstition, still talk about connecting with nature. So I think, in a sense, this is one of the most fundamental and basic, and it's found in shamanic societies and hunter-gatherer societies in children. In a sense, I think it's one of the most primal forms of spiritual experience.
Now, you started your career as a plant biologist.
Yes.
And that's how you, in fact, that was your window to spirituality. Let's, for our listeners and for those who are watching us, let's define what we can call a spiritual experience. Is it expanded awareness? Is it going to a more fundamental level of existence, which is beyond our mental constructs? How would you define spirituality?
I define it as an experience of being part of something greater than oneself, a conscious experience. And what's so interesting about the 7 ones I discuss in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, is they're so different. You know, meditation, usually you're sitting quietly, you're not doing anything. Whereas singing and chanting, you're actually making sounds, you're chanting with other people, it's a communal experience very often. And music is one of the most fundamental, and Darwin was one of the first to point out that human language probably came from singing in the first place. People sang and danced before they talked, and this is now, among evolutionary theorists, fairly generally accepted. It's fundamental to our nature. And singing and dancing connect us, there's the literal vibration in the body, and as you know, my wife Chopra has been doing this for years, chanting. We come into resonance with other people through singing together. And then if we sing traditional mantras or chants, then through morphic resonance, my idea of memory and nature, we connect with those who've done it before. So in all these ways, we're connected with our bodies first and foremost through the vibration of the sound.
Because ultimately all of nature, even the stars and galaxies in your body and our mind, they're all made of the same stuff, or which turns out not to be stuff.
Which turns out to be at the same time vibratory in nature. Correct. And also to have this awareness or consciousness aspect. And I think that these different spiritual practices, you see, singing and chanting are about activities and movements. Meditation is usually about minimum movement. Pilgrimage is about lots of movement, I mean, especially if you walk. But
there's an attitude that goes with that.
It's an attitude that goes with it. And I first got really into the idea of pilgrimage living in India, where it's still such an important tradition.
Correct.
I mean, all over India, as you know, you see groups of people on pilgrimages, and sadhus heading to a cave in the Himalayas or a temple.
Yeah, I'm about to take one myself, so I do that once in a while.
Yes. Well, what's happening in Europe is fascinating at the moment, because although Europe's much more secular than the United States, or in fact anywhere else in the world, there's an astonishing revival of pilgrimage going on. As I discuss in my book, the revival of this big pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain.
My wife has been to that, yeah.
I mean, it's that when it started in the 1980s, it was revived. In 1987, 1,000 people walked there. Last year, 300,000 people walked there. And this has helped trigger off a revival of pilgrimage all over Europe. In Norway, the pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Olaf in Trondheim Cathedral. In England, the British Pilgrimage Trust, of which I'm a patron, we're reviving the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes in England to Canterbury and elsewhere.
That's beautiful.
And people who don't normally go to church or have spiritual or religious practices love this. And I think that what it is a literal physical expression of a spiritual quest, going to a holy place. And holy places are traditionally places that connect the heavens and the earth, the above and the below. And actually, literally so. One of the features of holy places is they have literal vertical dimensions, standing stones, megaliths, obelisks in Egypt. In India, in front of temples, those sort of metal flag posts, I've forgotten what they're called, but most temples have them, and spires and towers and minarets.
And in England, when you go towards Glastonbury and all those areas.
Yes, the great Glastonbury tower, the tower.
That's right, yes.
So the point is that in the traditional ancient world, these were the highest structures, and we now know that these structures actually attract lightning. You can see on YouTube videos of lightning, it's sort of funneled in to the highest place. That's why they all have lightning conductors on them. And so they literally connect the heaven and the earth.
Yes.
And people used to think lightning was a kind of frictional product of electricity between the clouds and the earth. But the new thinking is that the energy of the sun and the galaxy streams in to the ionosphere, charges it up, the solar wind and so on. And there are these sprites from the ionosphere to the clouds. It's electricity literally coming from the heavens down into the earth. And when there's more solar activity, the northern lights, the southern lights get stronger, there's more lightning on earth. So these ancient sacred places are in the most literal and physical sense places of connection of heaven and earth. And they are also places where there's a memory of all those who've had spiritual experiences before.
In the morphogenetic field.
Yes. And so the journey itself, where you go with an intention, you're walking, is best when done walking, of course, because you link to the landscape, to the nature, to the land. And then you arrive in this place, you have an intention. And what I learned in India and what I do in England, and what I suggest others do, is before you go in, you circumambulate it, because that makes it the center. And we find this in all traditions, the walking around it first.
Ramana Maharshi's ashram.
Yes, round Arunachalam.
Yeah,
I've done that, yes.
Yes.
I'm afraid I didn't do it barefoot.
I see.
But
I did it barefoot.
I only did part of it barefoot,
Yes.
but my feet are not tough enough to do.
It took the whole night. So Rupert Sheldrake's book is called Science and Spiritual Practices, and it's been out in England for almost a year. It's now being released in the United States. You can go to Amazon or any online bookstore. Look for Science and Spiritual Practices by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. So, Rupert, let's talk about a few other things that I've learned from you over the years. The connection between human consciousness and the consciousness of other species, including plants, but also other mammals and even birds, because I first came across the story of Enkisi on your website.
Yes.
These are very fascinating examples, about dogs and humans having what I think are non-local communication, and even that story about Enkisi that I read a few years ago. Can we share that with our audience a little bit?
Yes. Well, I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about dogs that know when their owners are coming home, and cats that know when their owners are coming home, and other kinds of unexplained animal powers like telepathy, the sense of direction, and premonitions. And when that book came out, I received many emails from people with stories about their animals. And one was from a young woman, an artist, who lives in the United States, in New York State, in fact, who told me that her parrot had a vocabulary of hundreds of words, more than any previous recorded parrot, far more than the famous parrot Alex that belonged to Irene Pepperberg. And that not only did this parrot speak in sentences, but also picked up her thoughts. And the most dramatic examples were when she's asleep, the parrot sleeps in her bedroom, and it wakes her up from her dreams by commenting loudly on what she's dreaming about.
That's amazing.
So, this is off the end of the scale of anything else. I have a database of more than 5,000 stories or case histories from people about their animals.
How can people, access this database? They can go to your website?
Well, what I do is summarize these in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. There's a new edition out in the United States with updated in the light of many more stories I've had.
In that same book?
Yes. It's a second edition of Dogs That Know. I don't put the full database online because people don't always want details of their own most intimate relationships put in the public domain. But I summarize the results from it. And anyway, I went to see Amy, the young woman who owns Nikisi, who's still alive, and parrots live to 75.
Oh, she's in Paris.
Yes. No, the parrot She still lives in the United States, in
Casey.
New York State, yes. Nkisi is the parrot.
And is alive.
And is still alive, yes. Nkisi is now 22.
I see.
And African grey parrots can live to 75.
I see.
And so Nkisi's vocabulary is now about 2,000 words. In fact, just a few days ago, I went to visit Nkisi. And,
here in New
yes,
York?
in New York State, yes.
New York. And so, does she still have this ability?
Oh, yes. What I did when she told me about this is I went to meet her and we set up all these experiments where the parrot was in a separate room being filmed. Aimee was in a separate room on a different floor. We had envelopes, sealed envelopes containing photographs. And the idea was that Aimee would open one of these pictures. She didn't know what was in it. Spend 2 minutes looking at the photo, for example, of flowers. And then in another room, way beyond anything that the parrot couldn't see her or hear her, we were filming the parrot, and when she looked at a picture of flowers, the parrot said, "That's a flower, they're flowers, they're pretty flowers." And then she looked at a picture of someone, two people hugging, and the parrot said, "It's a hug, give me a hug." And so there's this extraordinarily literal
even though the parrot is not visually
Oh
seeing.
no, the parrot's in another room on another floor in the same building, but there's no sensory communication at all. So this parrot is picking up her thoughts. And a lot of people who have dogs or cats say, if only it could talk about their animal. Well, here's an animal that actually can. And it's, I think, the most remarkable case in the whole world of telepathic communication with an animal.
That is absolutely fascinating. So what does this tell us? There's a domain of existence where we're all inseparable or connected? Or...
Well, not necessarily all. I mean, in my work on telepathy with humans and animals, I've done it with dogs and their owners, cats, parrots, horses. They have a strong bond with their owners, their person. In the human domain, one of the strongest kinds of telepathy, which I'm investigating at the moment, is between mothers and babies. Many mothers find their milk let down when their baby is crying, even if they're miles away. And in the past, they'd just go home. Now they look on their smartphone and they ring home or look on a video baby monitor. Their milk lets down, their breasts are responding to the need of the baby from miles away. It's not an intellectual thing, it's the body, and based on the bond.
Because they're inseparable.
Because they're bonded. And the commonest kind in the modern world, telephone telepathy, where people think of someone who then calls, is again something that happens primarily between people who are bonded, between best friends, twins, mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, lovers. It doesn't happen with insurance salesmen or strangers. So telepathy isn't about being connected with everybody and everything. It's about being connected with members of the group to whom you're bonded. And it works most strongly between people who are strongly bonded.
So recently I was contacted by a woman who has a child with autism who's now about 12, 13. But ever since he could speak, he would be able to read his mother's thoughts. In fact, he would come home from school and say, "Why were you talking to so-and-so about me?" So I went with a pediatrician who's a specialist in these children on the autism spectrum who have some of these abilities. And so we had this woman, we gave her something to read. We wrote it down. We wrote down the alphabet in certain order, wrote down certain words, and then gave her actually something to read. And the boy was in another room in front of a computer, but because of his autism, his hand coordination is not that good, so he struggles to find the right key. But everything that she was reading, he was typing out on the computer with 100% accuracy, 100% accurate, not one single miss. So afterwards we went to him and we said, how do you do it? He says, I love my mother so much that I can get into her mind and then I can see what she's seeing. That was his explanation.
Well, it's probably quite accurate.
Yes.
And I've also looked at cases of children with learning difficulties, some of whom have incredibly strong telepathic bonds with their mothers. And I think most children have this to some extent when they're young. It often fades away. It fades away, interestingly, more with sons than with daughters. With telephone telepathy, the most spectacular cases are mother and daughter cases. And on the whole, as common knowledge is that women are more intuitive than men on the whole. In my own research, that turns out to be just exactly the case. So the telephone telepathy thing is more with mothers and daughters.
I see.
But it remains strongest when there are learning needs or problems with the child, where the need for this communication is so strong.
So what prevents good scientists from actually looking at this data? I mean, it's their belief system? It's the superstition of matter?
Yes, it's the superstition of matter, because they have to lead a split life. I once gave a talk at the European Molecular Biology Institute in Heidelberg, Germany. And this is molecular biologists, the most hardcore of reductionist scientists. But I spoke in the afternoon beforehand to the director who'd invited me to give a talk. And I talked about telephone telepathy, and I said, have you ever had this experience? And he said, well, yes. He said, I know when my wife's calling me, and she always seems to know when I'm calling her. And so during my talk to all these molecular biologists, I said, I know that many of you would feel this is impossible because, you know, the standard paradigm says the mind's nothing but the brain, it's inside the head, it couldn't have effects at a distance. But the empirical question is, have you actually experienced it? And I said, surveys show that in Germany about 80% of the population have had this experience. And what I want to find out is whether molecular biologists are completely different from everybody else. So I said, if you've had this experience, could you put your hand up? And no hands went up. And then I looked at the director, and we got on quite well. And he told me himself just beforehand that he'd had the experience. So very slowly his hand went up.
I see.
And they were all watching him. And gradually hands went up all around the room until it was about 80%.
That's fascinating.
So the fact is that most scientists are normal people.
You're right.
And like, these are very common things. This telephone telepathy, it's normal, not paranormal. It's part of everyday life for lots of people. They experience it too. But when they're at work, they have to pretend that it doesn't happen or that it's make-believe or something, because the belief system is so strong. I mean, people go along with these belief systems even if they don't believe them. And, you know, in Russia under Brezhnev, most people pretended to be communists, even if they weren't. And when the communist empire collapsed, you know, how many were real communists? Not many.
It's
the same in science.
China.
Exactly. It's the same in science.
Yes.
And I think a lot of scientists don't really believe this stuff. And in private, as you must have found, many of them have these experiences. And
not Sam Harris and not Richard Dawkins.
Oh no, there's a hardcore. There's a hardcore.
They're getting even more militant now.
There's a hardcore of militant evangelical atheist materialists.
They're missionaries.
But they're missionaries, but they're actually a minority. We recently organized a survey in Britain and Germany and France of practicing scientists, doctors and engineers about their practices and beliefs. About 25% are atheists, which is higher than the normal population. About 20% are agnostic. So about 45% said they were non-religious. But about 45% said they were spiritual and or religious. And so it's about equal. And even among the non-religious ones, about 10% regularly meditate. Quite a lot go to alternative health practitioners.
That's right.
So in their private lives, they're not really practicing atheists. I mean, some of them, it's a belief system, but even in their own experience, they're not really consistent. but the majority are not militant. And what the media do is focus on this majority, this minority of militant people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Susan Blackmore. But they don't speak for the majority of the community of scientists. And as you know, I lived in India and worked as a scientist there. And I didn't meet a single Indian scientist. Well, I met one who had been trained in Cambridge. But among my colleagues, I didn't meet a single one who was a believing materialist atheist. At work, they went along with the standard paradigm, but as soon as they got home, they became regular Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs or Jains. Or
I have to tell you a story. In the 1970s, I was training as an endocrinologist in neuroscience, and at the same time, I had become a disciple of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was, introducing TM to the world at that time.
I did it myself, yes.
So I went to the Himalayas once, and I told Maharishi that I was working with some scientists who had discovered the molecules of emotion. And he said, "Oh, tell me what they are." And I said, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, opiates. He said, they don't exist. The molecules don't exist. They are human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in consciousness. And I never forgot that when we have an experience, right now we are having an experience in consciousness of sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. And these experiences are very evanescent. I mean, for example, the experience of you coming into this room is over, right? Or by the time you hear my words, it's over. And that's, Wittgenstein said, we are asleep, our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming. So Maharishi said to me, that's the dream, that the molecule is the dream, that thing is a human construct for a very fundamental movement in consciousness, which is modifying itself as a sensation, as a perception, as a color, as a sound, and as a knowing. And a human knowing at that. And then we give it a name and suddenly it becomes real. That's oxytocin, that's a galaxy, that's a star, this is a hand, this is a body. But it's all consciousness modifying itself as experience and knowing. I mean, that was 40 years ago. And before all these discussions on the so-called hard problem of consciousness, because if consciousness is fundamental, then there's no hard problem. Everything is a byproduct of consciousness.
Exactly. I, like you in the 1970s,
yes.
I was very impressed by
Right.
Maharishi's teachings.
Right.
And I was also very impressed when I did TM first, I think in 1971. By the way, they said, just do it, try it. It's not about believing
Right.
something, it's about experiencing something.
Correct.
That had a deep effect on me, and indeed my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, is in that tradition.
I see that, I read it, yes.
And I've seen for years with my wife Jill Peirce, who teaches chanting and meditation as a spiritual practice, that people who come to her come with all sorts of beliefs. They may come from different religious backgrounds, they may be atheists or agnostics, but it's not about the belief, it's about the experience. And that's why I think when we start from experience, we get a much more accurate relationship to what reality is than starting from belief systems. And of course, in all religions, they start from experience. I mean, the rishis and the teachings in the Upanishads.
Scientists start from experience. They don't have anywhere else to start from. All theories are in consciousness. All experiments are thought of in consciousness.
Yes, and experiments are
observations
experiences.
are made in consciousness. Yeah, they're all experiences.
I mean, in French, the word for experiment and experience is the same, expérience.
So you've been hearing this conversation between Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and myself. The book is Science and Spiritual Practices. We have all of you saying that you're enjoying this conversation. Before we finish, Rupert, do you have anything to share about your book? Of course, we're going to put a link to the book, but do you have anything else to say?
Well, what I do in this book is not only discuss the science and the history of these practices and their evolutionary background, but at the end of each chapter suggest 2 simple ways of putting this into practice. This is rather influenced by you, Deepak, because you're always practical. I mean, you always make practical suggestions.
That's because I'm a physician. Prescriptions
yes,
are my
yes.
hobby. But these days they're not pharmaceuticals.
Yes. So I have these practices like connecting with nature, pilgrimage, and so on. For example, one of my suggestions on pilgrimage is turning journeys into pilgrimages. I mean, pilgrimage was banned in Northern Europe by Protestants at the Reformation, and I think that's why the English invented tourism. It's a form of secularized pilgrimage. It's a form of frustrated pilgrimage, actually, because tourists go to holy places, but they don't know what to do when they get there.
Well, they go to Buckingham Palace now.
Yes. Well, they still go to the great cathedrals and the temples.
Yes.
And, like in India, they go to the great temples. But when they get there, they can't do a puja because they think they're modern people who are primarily, they have to pretend they're mainly interested in art history. So one of my suggestions is to switch back from tourism to pilgrimage. It's a simple paradigm shift, and go to these places with an intention to give thanks or to ask for something or to make an offering. And I myself, when I visit cities like New York, I try and turn the journey into a pilgrimage. So I go to St. John the Divine, the cathedral, or St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I light a candle, and I say a prayer. And I think connecting with it, when I'm in India, I go to the temple in the center of the town or the city. When I'm near a Sufi shrine, I go to the Sufi shrine. I think these are all holy places that we can connect with, and they're inclusive. You don't have to be a Hindu to go to a Hindu temple. Right. You don't have to be a Christian to go to a cathedral. They're open to all of us. So my point in this book really is that by small things we can actually transform the way we lead our lives, not just through private practices like meditation, but through relating to the places we go to and the way we relate to other people, through singing and chanting, for example.
We have Ramanand Dixit from India. He's a big fan, he's saying. He's sending you greetings. Well, Rupert, this has been very enjoyable. Almost 50 minutes have gone by. I encourage you to order the book, Science and Spiritual Practices. Check out Rupert's website, which is rupertsheldrake.org.
No, sheldrake.org. www.sheldrake.org. O-R-G.
www.sheldrake.org. Check that out. Ramanand, thank you. Julia, thank you. Elena, thank you. She says she's getting the book right now. And Vivian, thank you. This has been delightful. We've had people right now from everywhere. Rupert from Europe, from England, from East Europe, Latin America, Australia, India. I'll send you a link so you can put this conversation, and we'll have it up everywhere on social media. It's been a pleasure to see you again after a couple of years.
Yeah,
it's always fun
see you again, Deepak. Yes.
to see you always and learn from you. Okay, goodbye and thank you.